Clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 6, National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Ryan.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. In 2024, access to the internet should be a universal basic right. Access to the technology and infrastructure that enables every person in Australia to work, to study and to stay connected. But unfortunately, here in Australia, we're falling woefully short of that standard. Decades of government cost-cutting, privatisation and corporatisation of our essential services have degraded our internet infrastructure. In Ryan, my electorate, many people are still dealing with the fallout of the botched NBN upgrades, frustrated that they can't watch a movie with their family, they can't work or study from home or play games with their friends, despite paying some of the highest prices in the world for home internet. What's really frustrating is that it didn't have to be like this. The NBN could have been affordable and accessible for everyone, providing gold standard internet access right across Australia. So how did we get here in this almighty mess? It started with previous governments' disastrous decisions that led to the privatisation of Telstra in the 90s. This left us without the basic bones to deliver high-speed broadband. It's such a common and such a sad story. The government selling off yet another essential public asset and good to a for-profit corporation, setting the stage for cost blowouts, for delays and the chaotic rollout we've been stuck with ever since. This was compounded by the government's decision to set up the NBN as a public corporation that had to turn a profit early in the rollout. So what we got was higher consumer prices and poorly prioritised rollout strategies. Then, in 2013, the LNP slashed funding and gave us a multi-technology mix, a kind of a Frankenstein's monster, a network of copper wires and outdated hybrid fibre coaxial, that's HFC, completely inadequate for meeting modern internet demands. And here we are with unreliable, subpar internet in too many homes in Ryan and in so many places throughout Australia. Take the Gap or Mitchelton. Residents there still stuck with the HFC, dealing with absolutely abysmal speeds. A recent survey I ran in Ryan showed that over 60% of respondents are unhappy with their internet, with nearly 20% saying it's very, very slow. To make matters worse, 40% of respondents aren't even getting the speeds they're paying for, so they're stuck paying high prices for a subpar service in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We're stuck relying on outdated technology that simply cannot deliver. Half of Ryan is reporting unreliable internet with frequent dropouts. Australia is falling behind. While other nations are embracing fibre to the premise, the gold standard we should have had right from the start. And it's not just speed and reliability, it's the cost. Over 74% of the respondents to my survey said that their internet is just too expensive. That's a huge number of people in my community being ripped off, while, to rub salt in those wounds, corporate executives line their pockets. Telstra CEO Vicky Brady made $5.25 million. Optus CEO Kelly Bayer Rosmarin over $5 million, and former NBN boss Stephen Rue $3 million. All this during a cost of living crisis, while people in Kenmore and the Gap just can't even hold a simple Zoom call without the internet absolutely dropping out on them. Internet access is essential infrastructure. Just like roads or public transport, it should be affordable and accessible for everyone. That's why we fought to keep the NBN in public hands. It was the Greens who protected the NBN from being sold off. We secured the amendments to keep it public because we know that internet access is far too important to leave in the hands of for-profit corporate giants. The NBN should serve all Australians, not become a cash cow for a select few. So the Greens will consider this bill and move for a Senate inquiry to make sure all Australians have access to an affordable and functioning NBN. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Order. I thank the honourable member for Ryan. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm so pleased to be speaking to a bill that is all about making sure the NBN stays in public hands. We do not want to repeat the mistakes that were made with Telstra, which has led to my community really having to fight for what should be a right, and that is decent quality communications. And it's the same with the NBN. Now, I want to take everybody back a few decades, actually, to the 1990s and Paul Keating's Creative Nation, because Creative Nation turned out to be my awakening to why we need high-speed broadband. And I'll tell you why. Creative Nation had one aspect to it which was all about encouraging people to create digital content. The language might have been slightly different. I think we called it multimedia, but it was all about creating things that would be delivered through the internet at a time when the internet was still a very, very new beast. And there were several multimedia enterprise centres, and one of those was in Everleigh. And I had the privilege of working with IT people, first time really that I'd worked with IT people. My business partner and I, we were the content, our media training content, and we worked with artists and designers to create a multimedia program that would be delivered through the internet. And in fact, it was a long process and we all learnt a lot, but at the culmination of it was that my business was named as the creator of the best multimedia education product in the country. And I'm very proud of that. But this was the early 2000s by the time we got to this point, and it was not possible to commercialise the product that we'd spent several years creating because there was no way of delivering it to people through the internet. The speeds were not fast enough. We were still dialing up or had just switched across to ADSL. And so that was the first time, as a business person, I hit a wall, and that was a failure to have invested at that point into high-speed broadband. So that was, for me, a real wake-up. And I don't profess to be a savvy IT person, but I do know that when my business is constrained by something, I want to see solutions to it. It took some time before a solution was presented. And when Kevin Rudd announced that there would be this national broadband network of high-speed broadband, where video and audio, where you could have interactivity, where animations could be accommodated, I knew exactly the sort of people he was talking about it benefiting, and that was businesses like mine, with great IP and no method of delivering it effectively through the internet. So I have been a convert to the NBN from those very, very early days. And I knew very strongly what it was to be able to turn that NBN on. I was lucky enough that in the electorate, I had lost an election, but my community was one of the early beneficiaries. And I remember with the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, pushing the button in Windsor to turn on, metaphorically, the NBN in the Hawkesbury, one of the first places that it was rolled out to parts of the Hawkesbury. So I have followed really closely the rolling out of NBN. I have despaired at some of the pace of it. And when the Liberal government came to power and they turned a 21st century technology into a historic copper-led technology, I was really concerned about what the economic impacts that would have and the social impacts that would have for people. I was also horrified to hear the Liberal government declare that the NBN was done, the rollout was done, it was completed, it was finished. And because to hear that said, to declare it complete was really a signal that our job's done and there's no need for us to try and continue to improve the NBN that's available for people. Now, I know that in spite of a significant number of people having fibre, many people only had it to the curb, or they only had it to a node, or even worse, they had satellite or wireless. So to hear the Liberal government say it was complete, that was certainly not my experience in the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, that this thing had been finished. And it's not finished yet. There is still more to do. What that decision by those opposite did was really signal their intent that it was ready to sell off, that this essential infrastructure, sometimes the only infrastructure still standing when natural disasters hit, that infrastructure could be sold off to the highest bidder. So let's just think about how essential the national broadband network is. Well, if you didn't realise beforehand how essential it was, you certainly realised during COVID. What we all recognised then was that we needed this, whether we were a child studying with a bunch of 10-year-olds, whether we were a teenager or in our early 20s at university, whether we were adults working from home and trying to keep connected with our colleagues, for every demographic. And that includes people like my mum who really rely on access to data, not just, as Prime Minister Turnbull once said, to watch lots of movies, and she certainly doesn't have 5 movies playing in her house at the one time, which was, I think, we were told the only reason you need high-speed broadband is if that was happening. But she needs secure, reliable, trustworthy technology that's not going to go out in a storm. And I think that for people in the lower Blue Mountains in particular, we faced at the issue of having boxes that, when there was a storm, they would just self-combust, essentially. Sometimes they literally left little burn trails. Other times they just died. And it took a long time for the previous government to acknowledge that this was a problem, partly because the lower Blue Mountains community is one of the most storm-prone in the country. When you look at the geology, that explains it, I'm told. So to have systems for people to be told that's good enough, that is all you deserve, that'll do you. Well, my community very clearly said no, it is not good enough. I think as we go forward, from there we've seen the benefits of high-speed broadband for health and telehealth, and those benefits will continue to be experienced as we go forward. And small business, I think small business now would wonder how it would survive without a decent broadband service. So the gold star is obviously fibre to the home. And in the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, we are, and even parts of a lot of other parts of Western Sydney, there are still places where we're having to fix up the mess of fibre to the curb and fibre to the node. I recently was up in Blackheath, and it has been a really long, slow wait for Blackheath and other areas. Back in 2017, the Minister for Communications, before we were in government, she and I were up there, and we heard why they felt they were being shortchanged by the Liberals' fibre to the node rollout, which relied on that old copper to do the connection from a box somewhere down your street into your home. But finally, there is a rollout happening that is shifting that fibre to the node to fibre to the curb. And I have never been so delighted to see streets being dug up as I was in Blackheath watching that rollout happen. And what I also noticed, having followed the rollout from its very first days around Bligh Park, is that the degree of skill that's involved. You know, we've learnt so much, and our operators have learnt so much about how to do this neatly, how to do it effectively and how to do it quickly. And that was a real delight to see. The upgrading that we are doing of the NBN, because we believe people should continue to see improvements in their service if they don't have a gold plate service, will mean that around 3,000 people living homes in the Hawkesbury, everywhere from McGrath's Hill, Currajong Heights, North Richmond, Pitt-Town, Vineyard and Freeman's Reach, about 3,000 people across those areas will shift from fibre to the node to fibre to the premises, fibre coming all the way into their home. And in the Blue Mountains, it's about 14,000 more households who will have access to what they should have had in the first place, quality fibre. And that's everywhere from Hazelbrook right up the mountains to Mount Victoria. But there is still work to be done, and that's why it's so important that the NBN is kept in public hands. There's more to do to make sure it stays in the future affordable for people. The consequence of privatisation, as we know, is that shareholders' needs are put ahead of everybody else's, and that has terrible consequences for us as a society, as a community and as an economy. I think in an electorate like mine, where we have areas that are not just peri-urban but the equivalent of regional, the equivalent of rural and even the equivalent of remote, that there are ongoing challenges in getting the very best standard of NBN. I've got people on satellite and wireless. And my view is that we should continue to be looking to deliver a higher quality of service to those people, and that will only happen if the NBN stays in public hands. From my perspective, it is not over for those people. I am never one to shy away from advocating for my community, and I absolutely understand the needs that people have in those areas, particularly where fibre comes down a street but stops halfway down just because someone drew a line on the map in the original design. So there are lots of areas where I will continue fighting and advocating for an expansion of fibre for my community. Deputy Speaker, Labor founded the National Broadband Network. We founded it to provide fast, reliable, affordable broadband to all Australians. Not just to some, not just to the lucky ones who live in a densely populated area, but to all Australians. And we are delivering our vision for a world-class fibre network, and the difference between a couple of years ago and now is stark in my community. For a start, I get to have fibre to my premises. My entire street, the entire suburb of Winmalee, the entire lower Blue Mountains can now say, yes, I'd like to get that fibre to the curb to come all the way into my home. And it only happens when you have a government that has a commitment to genuinely trying to level the playing field for every Australian business, for every Australian, no matter where they live. And only by keeping the NBN in government ownership can we continue to deliver on that vision. And that's why this legislation is here. That's why we're here on our side arguing that we need to secure in legislation the future of the NBN and make sure it remains in public ownership. This is a critical infrastructure. It reaches to over 12.4 million premises across Australia. Currently, more than 8.6 million homes and businesses are connected. That's a lot of people whose lives are affected. Keeping NBN in public hands will ensure that the company itself has the certainty necessary for its investment planning and for all that operational decision-making needed to maximise the economic and social benefits of the NBN. And ongoing government ownership of the NBN will help keep those wholesale broadband prices more affordable for consumers than if the company was in private ownership. What we should have going forward is the opposite of what happened to my business in the early 2000s. We should not have businesses who say, I can't do my business because I'm constrained by the NBN, or I'm constrained by a lack of capacity to be able to send things through this magic thing of the internet. Every business, every home, every older person, every child should have the same access and the same ability to use this infrastructure. It is crucial public infrastructure and should never be sold off. Just as telephones should never have been sold off, particularly when we didn't know how technology was going to evolve and we end up with a situation where there's inequity in that system now, nor should the NBN. The NBN should stay in public hands now and forever.
Order. I thank the honourable member for Macquarie. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Commitment to Public Ownership Bill of 2024. And I've been in the House for most of the member for Macquarie's speech, and I must say large parts of her speech I really agree with. The NBN, the importance of it, it's very important for infrastructure, its importance in emergencies, the fact that we need to, quote, secure reliable technology, particularly in storm-prone communities. I am really glad that the Minister for Communications and the member for Macquarie have been able to get fibre to the premises within your electorate. Perhaps the member for Macquarie would be able to explain to me why the Minister for Communications won't assist me in my electorate of Hughes to get fibre to the premises in the suburb of Bundeena. This is a suburb which is far more isolated than the Blue Mountains. I note the interjections over there. Could it be that assistance was given from the minister to those on that side of the chamber with the same assistance has not been provided on this side of the chamber? And as I hear more interjections, I will read directly from a letter that the minister wrote back to me refusing my community, but she's obviously been very helpful for communities on your side of the chamber. So, Deputy Speaker, I will return to the issue of Bundeena, and I am appreciating these interjections because I'd be very interested to hear whether or not other members on that side have been given the NBN upgrades that have not been afforded to those in my electorate. So, the purpose of this bill, the stated purpose of this bill when this was introduced, Deputy Speaker.
The member for Hughes has the call.
The stated purpose from the Minister for Communications was that this will amend original Labor legislation to remove conditions enabling a future government to privatise NBN. The bill provides certainty to stakeholders, including broadband consumers, the wider telecommunications industry, broadband retailers and NBN Co, that the Commonwealth will continue to retain ownership of NBN Co. Well, Deputy Speaker, unless I've missed something over the last few weeks, there has been no conversation about NBN, about changing the public ownership, except from those on that side of the chamber. And why is this? This is legislation that is in fact amending the government's previous legislation. So I'll just by way of background, Deputy Speaker, the Rudd Labor government, we all remember that Labor government, announced the establishment of a new NBN Co to build and operate a new fast national broadband network. And in that, when the legislation was introduced, it was anticipated that the government would be the NBN Co's major shareholder, but there would also be significant private investment in the company. Quote, the government will make an initial investment in the company, but intends to sell down its interest in the company within 5 years after the network is built and fully operational, consistent with market conditions and national identity security considerations. Then we have the introduction of the NBN Companies Bill 2011, passed in March 2011, and in the second reading speech, the then Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, who is, I believe, the current Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, stated, the first bill in the package, the NBN Companies Bill, also sets out, and this is important, Deputy Speaker, and I quote, arrangements for the eventual sale of the Commonwealth's stake in the company once the NBN rollout is complete, including provisions for independent and parliamentary reviews prior to any privatisation, and for the Parliament to have the final say on the sale. As such, the bill deals with arrangements for both today and into the future. And that is a direct quote, Deputy Speaker, from the then Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, who now holds the highest political office in the land. The Then, if we come to the actual nature of NBN Co, it's an unlisted public company limited by shares incorporated under the Corporations Act and is a Commonwealth company for the purposes of various other acts. It was established in 2009 as a government business enterprise by the federal government, which is its sole shareholder. So if we now come to 2022, Deputy Speaker, as I've said before, this bill is nothing but a sad stunt. This is designed to create confected debate that somehow those on our side, or perhaps their friends in the Greens, somewhere, somebody has some intention to sell off the NBN. There is no intention on our side. Nobody's talking about changing the ownership of the NBN, not the Coalition and not anyone else that I've heard in this place. This is just a shambolic attempt by a government that is really frightened to address the real issues that are affecting Australians, which is cost of living. And also in my electorate, there are plenty of Australians very upset with the NBN service that has been delivered under this Communications Minister, under this government, and even more upset. No, I'd ask the honourable member, you are very welcome to come to Bundeena, as I have done, seen the sort of internet coverage that they have down there, made representations to the minister, who was— I'll quote that in a minute. Look, Labor has done this before, Deputy Speaker. They are the party of Mediscare. Now it's nothing but NBN scare. This is done to simply distract from the issues that they know. They've been back in their electorates for weeks, those on that side. Their constituents are telling them exactly the same thing that our constituents are telling us. They are not happy with this government. This government is not addressing their cost of living issues. They are a party known for making up fake election campaigns. So, Deputy Speaker, when we see a government that's getting hammered on all fronts, what happens? Oh, let's quickly— I wonder how this transpired in the party room. Hey, Bing, I've got a really good idea today. Let's pretend that the Coalition are going to sell off the NBN. Oh, yes, that sounds like a really good idea. So at a time when Australians are desperate for help with cost of living crisis, this Labor Party is more focused on political games than fixing the problems facing everyday families. We know it on our side, and my electorate knows it, and your electorates know it as well. They are now seeing it. They're seeing it. They are seeing what we have seen sitting here for 2.5 years. Probably a government that will go down as the worst government in history. My parents, who are old enough to remember Whitlam, always said to me, we'll never see a government worse than Whitlam. Then we had Rudd. We'll never see a government worse than Rudd. We are now seeing a government far worse than either of those two former failed Labor governments. And, Deputy Speaker, I just want to touch on what has happened with the NBN under this minister and under the watch of this Prime Minister. There's been a major decline in the NBN. They have essentially hammered Australians with massive NBN price increases. We've seen 6 million families smashed by NBN prices of up to 14% since October last year. 14%. And over the same time period, the NBN's brownfields business, meaning existing homes, has lost almost 100,000 customers. So how on earth can this be lauded as some great success of the Prime Minister and the Minister for Communications? It's not. This is just a lame stunt from a lame government. And they could, instead— the Minister for Communications particularly, and the Prime Minister, could be talking about an issue that is of concern in the community, which is the need for gambling advertising reform. I asked the question 3 weeks ago to the Minister for Communications, and she couldn't answer it. My friend, the member for Casey, also Menzies, apologies, Deputy Speaker, also asked the question. We were the two from this side that were on that inquiry. It was chaired by the former member for Dunkley, Peter Murphy, and at the time there were commitments made after Ms Murphy passed away, there were commitments made from a whole lot of us that we would continue with the work that was done on that inquiry. And what has happened since? It was presented to the minister in June 2023. Where is it? She still can't answer questions. The minister cannot answer questions in question time as to when she's going to whether she's going to adopt the recommendations and when. In 1996, Deputy Speaker, John Howard had been admitted for a couple of weeks and we had the tragic massacre down in Port Arthur. John Howard at the time had to stare down members of his own party, members of his coalition party and a lot of the Liberal Party's base because he knew in his heart that Australia needed gun reform. That changed the nature of Australia. Why is it then that full bipartisan support, thank you, Minister, full bipartisan support, and that report that was given to the minister had bipartisan support. It was unanimous. Yes? So then the Prime Minister, I would suggest that the Prime Minister can take something from the John Howard playbook and actually think, I'm going to act in the nation's interests here. I'm going to act in the nation's interest and not those in the interests of some of his friends and allies, because he has missed an opportunity to demonstrate strong leadership, moral courage and political conviction on a national social and health epidemic. Ms Murphy's husband has asked what is going on. Labor, what are you doing about this report? The Reverend Tim Costello has been asking about it. Anna Bardsley contacted the Prime Minister 3 weeks ago and said, I am coming to Canberra this week because I need to speak to the Prime Minister about gambling reform and about gambling harm. She couldn't get an audience with the Prime Minister, but she got an audience with me, and the stories from her and her colleagues about the devastation of gambling harm on them, on their families, was heartbreaking. Women who have served time in prison for theft to simply feed their gambling habits. Another spoke about first gambling at the age of 7, as well as the social impacts online gambling has had on his Asian Australian community. Australians love a punt, Deputy Speaker. Today is Melbourne Cup Day. Most Australians gamble responsibly. They do it with friends. They do it as a social activity. They gamble with money they know that they can afford to lose. That is fine, but there are, for a number of Australians, gambling harm causes a massive problem for them. Bundina. I've been asked about Bundina from somebody over on that side. I went to the minister. After April, I went to the minister and said, can you please assist this community of mine? They need fibre to the premises or fibre to the curb. Minister wrote back to me, and I quote, NBN Co has advised that there have never been any plans to provide fibre to the curb services to Bundina. However, parts of Bundina have been included in the project to eventually deliver fibre to the premises upgrades. That was supposed to have occurred in 2023. The minister has now changed the date to 2025 and then indicated at the end of the letter, unfortunately, this process is lengthy and has significantly delayed the delivery of upgrades to the Bundina area. Deputy Speaker, nobody on this side is talking about privatising or selling off NBN.
Sorry, in accordance with Standing Order 43, the debate will be resumed at a later hour, and the member will have permission to continue when the debate's resumed. Are there any statements